For 200 years, Black Americans have sought to protect their basic rights through the Constitution. Its interpretations are based on the lives of ordinary women and men, and their struggles to make this 200-year-old document come alive today.
A New York political science professor says that the U.S. Constitution is for white people. He says it is now, and it has always been. What is your thought on that?
He's half right. The Constitution cuts in two very distinctive ways for Black Americans. If one looks at the basic document, the first 7 articles, what one sees is that the Constitution marked the beginning of the nation's race policy. And that's an important historical point. Prior to the Constitution, each of the several colonies had a slightly different policy toward blacks. The view of the status of blacks vis-a-vis whites, indentured servants, Indians, varied from place to place. The Constitution established a fairly consistent national policy, rendered blacks distinctly inferior. That's the sense in which the Constitution was for whites. If one then looks at the amendments to the Constitution, the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, looks at the lofty ideals in those amendments having to do with individual rights and freedoms. One sees in there a great deal of hope for Black Americans and for lots of other people. And for the past 200 years, we actually have been arguing over which part of the Constitution really applies to Black Americans. Is it that part of the Constitution that renders them 3/5 of a person, distinctly inferior? Or is it that part of the Constitution, the amendments that contain the lofty ideals? And sadly, I'm afraid that confusion, that vacillation, that debate over which part of the Constitution is most pertinent to us continues to this day.
Mr. Brown, what about you? Would you say that the Constitution is for whites and it really did not apply, let's take it in a historical sense, did it apply to blacks? Did they mean blacks when they wrote the Constitution?
Absolutely not. I would agree with Ed's comments and perhaps shed some light from a different perspective. The Constitution was essentially, or in a very important respect, an economic document. It established the basis on which commerce, trade, was to take place among the states of the Confederacy. One of the reasons for the Constitution was that each state was setting up tariffs and preventing the passage of goods between the states. And it also established a national body to deal with, an effective national body to deal with foreign governments. But if you look at the Constitution as an economic document, then one of the elements that it certainly had to deal with was property. And black slaves were property. And the Constitution, in 3 specific areas in the original document, makes it clear that that property interest in the South was going to be maintained under the new Constitution. The provision in the Constitution stated specifically that there was an obligation on the part of the citizens and officials in states that were not slave states to return to the owners in the slave states their property in the case of fleeing from a slave state to the north. Another provision in the Constitution, the original Constitution, specifically established for purposes of determining how much representation there would be in the Congress for each of the states, specifically stated that a slave or a person in service, is the language of the Constitution, was to be counted as 3/5 of a person for that purpose. And in striking that balance and saying that our forebears, each individual was to count as 3/5 of a person, the purpose for that provision was to provide representation to the South, whose population of whites was not as large as that in the North. The effect of it was to provide the South with assurance that the northern part of the country would not be able to impose its will in the national legislature on the South.
But
And so by
blacks-
counting us for that purpose, it had the effect of enhancing the political power of whites in the South. But at the same time, of course, the slaves had no vote for representation.
There's some interesting ironies as you look at the issue of slavery in America. As the speakers before said, the Constitution was conceived in contradiction. Freedom and justice for all, but it was suppressing a group. It also discriminated against whites without property. That's the other thing that whites don't understand, that only folks who could vote and participate in the Congress, those who own property, and most whites didn't own property. So it was really an elite class of people who were running the country and constructing laws for everybody else. It's also true that in the North, it just wasn't economically feasible, and so that our condition in this country has been shaped less by compassion for us than the economics of our condition. But the irony I find in around 1800, when Spain ceded Louisiana to France, back to France, I guess it was. And at the same time, there was a Haitian Revolution going on with Toussaint Louverture that started, I guess, in around 1791. And it was successfully, and then so that they were successful in 1803, which meant that Napoleon had to sell Louisiana Purchase to the United States, which meant that the slave trade was then expanded into that area. So it's interesting irony that the successful Haitian Revolution was responsible for the expansion of the slave trade in that area. There are just some interesting ironies.
But there was a time in the middle 1800s when it appeared that blacks were going to get certain rights. The 13th Amendment, the freeing slaves, the 14th Amendment, civil rights, the 15th Amendment. What happened?
The 13th Amendment outlawed slavery. The 14th Amendment, on its face, extended the rights and privileges of citizens of the United States to all the citizens of the United States, and provided that all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States and of the states in which they reside. And the 15th Amendment, on its face, guaranteed voting rights. The backdrop for all of this, and I guess I'm going to keep coming back to it, is that the treatment or the reaction or the response to the black interest in this country has almost always been dependent on greater, larger global issues having to deal with economics and with politics. And by 1896, 40 years after the 15th Amendment was adopted, most of those rights guaranteed by the Constitution had been completely emasculated in one way or another.
But before they were emasculated, was there a time when the Constitution was adhered to? I mean, here you have 3 amendments giving blacks certain rights. I mean, was there a time? This is Reconstruction. So
We began making some important progress. Freedmen's bureaus were established throughout the South. Government and private organizations, church groups moved into the South to establish schools for blacks. Blacks, sometimes with assistance from whites, sometimes on their own, established their own banks, their own businesses. Blacks came to become very influential in the government of a number of southern states, and in fact, in the Congress of the United States. The first black senator in American history came from Mississippi, not from Massachusetts. We sometimes forget about that. But the Reconstruction era was fairly short-lived, from roughly 1865, which was the time of the passage of the 13th Amendment, the end of the Civil War, to around 1876. As Tyrone was saying, what happened in 1876, what happened to blacks in 1876 and thereafter, was the result of larger political forces. In that particular instance, an election in which Rutherford B. Hayes had to promise the South certain things in order to win a very close presidential election from his opponent, Tilden. The compromise basically was that Hayes would not assiduously enforce those amendments, nor would he assiduously enforce the 1875 Civil Rights Act, which was our first public accommodations law in the United States. Things went downhill from there. The nadir, I suppose, being the Plessy v. Ferguson decision of 1896, in which the Supreme Court established the separate but equal dogma that was to prevail for many decades thereafter.
Another infamous decision, right?
Another infamous decision, but a glowing dissent, which I commend. As a matter of fact, one of the interesting things about Supreme Court decisions is that they're usually fairly short and fairly readable, even to a lay audience. The Plessy decision, as important as it is only a few pages long, but it was in the dissent that the idea of a colorblind constitution arose.
Our Constitution is a conservative document. It's a document which is established to maintain the status quo unless an overwhelming majority to change that status quo can be marshaled. And one of the conservative elements in it structurally is the Supreme Court.
And was that the beginning of seeing the power that the Supreme Court can wield and how it can undermine what's in the Constitution? Was that the beginning of that?
Or liberate.
Or liberate?
It can use that power.
Both ways.
It can use that power in either direction, depending on the 9 people who happen to sit on the court. Now, certainly, it operates within limits. It operates within the limits of the Constitution itself. But as we've seen, this discussion is a prime example of the fact that the Constitution can, to an extent, mean what the 9 justices say it means.
Yeah. And if you don't have voting, if you're not participating in vote, you have no appeal to the political process. So then, therefore, you have to then look to the courts to make policy. And that's why blacks turned to the courts, because we didn't have the vote.
Abraham Lincoln saw the real issue that was involved in the Civil War.
That's right.
He said that if he could save the Union by setting the slaves free, he would do it in a moment. If he could save the Union
by keeping them
slaves, he would do it. That was the issue for him, and that was a tear between commercial interests between the 2 sections of the country.
But I think that we, as blacks, know an awful lot about those who rebelled against slavery, but we know very little about our economic history. And our faith and destiny in America has never been totally determined by whites, what whites would concede or not concede. If you look at during that very period, we had 14 millionaires even during the period of slavery. 14 millionaires.
Black
millionaires. We also had, for instance, in 1863, when 1,000 blacks were fired off the docks of Baltimore, Maryland, our response was not a march on Washington or to picket the State House. It was to establish the Chesapeake, Maine Dry Dock and Railroad Company, and we successfully operated a railroad in America for 18 years. When we were denied access to banks or to obtain loans to start businesses, we established 53 bank savings and loan associations. The Oddfellows had about $3 million in assets in 1908, which in today's dollars would be about $200 million. We had vast businesses, ship caulking, restaurant businesses that catered to blacks and whites were in control of blacks. So our capital assets during that period were formidable. And I would hate to compare what we did during those very troubled times with what we're doing today, but we'll talk about that.
Yes, well, do you want to do it now? Do it now.
I'll wait.
Okay.
Norma, the Constitution is really, it's a remarkable document. It's, as originally drafted, it's not nearly as remarkable as a lot of Americans like to believe that it was. Essentially what it did was establish a Republican form of government for a privileged class. That kind of government had existed in ancient Rome and in the city-states of Athens. It wasn't that new. It just hadn't been around for quite a long time. The truly remarkable thing about the Constitution, as written, occurred after the Civil War, when the guarantees that were set forth in the original Constitution were, on paper at least, extended to all of the people who inhabit these shores.
So it became more democratic.
That is the new thing in our Constitution as a social document.
And what about politicians? There were a lot of black politicians at one time, were there not? During Reconstruction, if we're going back.
Well, during Reconstruction, but after.
Were they effective when they were? I mean, what were they? How effective were they as politicians, and how extensive?
Well, partly because of the terms under which the Southern states were readmitted to the Union after secession. Blacks came to control or exert significant influence over the political structures of a number of states. And in fact, the Ku Klux Klan developed partly in reaction to or in resentment of that increased black political presence. I mean, it was genuinely offensive to many whites in the South then, and indeed it's still genuinely offensive to many whites, both in the North and the South, that blacks are making laws that govern their lives. But yes, a number of blacks served in Congress, a number of blacks served in state legislatures, and in the, several served in the U.S. Senate during the Reconstruction period. After the Compromise of 1876, after the Supreme Court began to revert basically to antebellum practices, an antebellum view of things, the combination of constitutional setbacks rendered by the Supreme Court and genuine physical intimidation by individuals, the night riders, the Klansmen, caused blacks to back out of active involvement in politics, at least in most of the southern states, for many years. And one will find for many decades in some counties in the South, particularly counties that had large black populations. Blacks were almost completely disenfranchised. And that was a situation that existed for well into the 20th century. Not until the 1940s, for example, did a new wave of voting rights cases begin to reach the Supreme Court. First having to do with the exclusion of blacks from party primaries and party caucuses, the famous Texas Jaybird Party Supreme Court decision in the 1940s. And a lot of those cases in the 1930s and 1940s actually set the stage for the things that we associate with the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s.
Was there a parallel in the 50s and 60s, in the 1950s and 60s, with the 1860s and 70s when we had laws, again, giving blacks, voting rights, giving blacks equal opportunity under the law? I mean, did you see this?
I would submit that there was not a parallel.
Okay.
And the reason I would submit that there was not a parallel is because in the 1860s, blacks were, to a great extent, the passive beneficiaries of changes that took place because of bigger issues. In the 1950s and 1960s, blacks were actively demanding change in a very, very insistent way, and the country had to respond to those demands.
You see the changes that occurred up until this point as all emanating from grassroots. They all came from...
Sure. Well, grassroots, if you want to define it in terms of international markets, in other words, change that the leadership always tries to accommodate what's happening out in the world around them, and they have to either, lead, follow, or get out of the way. And so I think the courts felt that it had to get on top of this situation, and so that it was a response. But I think as we move up into 54, where we really did ferment this change, the question is that maybe since we're moving now into the 50s and the 60s, the question that we have to go back and re-examine is whether or not there have been unintended, unfortunate consequences of some of the changes that have occurred since 54. I think that we as blacks in the nation are, particularly black communities, confused about what the Supreme Court decision was about. For me, someone who participated in the civil rights movement, I fought for desegregation. I did not fight for integration. And sometimes we keep confusing those two. Desegregation is a proper subject of public policy. Integration is an individual decision. So that we got hung up in, on the one hand, we became schizophrenic. On the one hand, we said, and I think we have to re-examine this at some point, about separate being inherently unequal, or was it strategically unequal, where we unequal? Because what that says about blacks, and some of us keep pushing this whole forced busing issue, which is really madness as far as I'm concerned, which expresses our schizophrenia. On the one hand, we identify whites as being racist and an enemy of ours, and then we send them our children to teach.
No, we're going to have fun.
This is where, now where we send our children to teach. And the schizophrenia is now on the one hand, when we are clear about what our mission is, all we need are the barriers to the marketplace removed. Entertainment, we need affirmative action programs to participate in basketball and football, right? All we need were the barriers removed. And we did it. Now we're disproportionately represented, okay? And we also want to preserve our black colleges. We don't want integration extended to the point where we'll destroy the black. We say, because you know why? Because we are clear about teaching our own black kids that black kids prosper better in black colleges than they do in white colleges. But when it comes to K through 12, we're not clear about how to teach our children. So then we say, bust them to white folks to teach. And it seems to me that those are the kind of contradictions that we are beset with today. To summarize my position, and I think this panel will probably split in the 50s and the 60s.
Okay.
And the 70s and the 80s.
And the 70s and the 80s and beyond. Where I split is that I fought for desegregation. I want the right to live where I choose and to send my children where I choose. But I also believe in pluralism. If I want to send my child to an all-black school and have them taught by black teachers, I should be able to select this also without being accused of being a separatist.
But you would also want the funds to be exactly the same. You'd want the government to give the same amount of money to your black school as they give to a white school.
Absolutely. And in
Which
fact,
was not the way they were doing.
No, and that's why I say that separate was not strategically equal. But to say it is separate is inherently unequal is very heavy. Because what you're really saying, and this is what I think our children are confused today, is that anything that is all black is all bad.
Separate is inherently unequal when the government is imposing that separation.
I totally agree with that.
That's the situation
but that
we were
is
dealing
segregation.
with. That
and
is
I'm
inherently
opposed to
unequal.
and I agree with you, but that's imposed de jure segregation, which I'm opposed to. But the opposite of that is desegregation. And I will fight long and hard to make certain that everybody has a chance to go where they choose. Jews have Yeshiva University established by Jews for Jews, but anyone can attend. Catholic University was established by Catholics for Catholics, but anyone can attend. That's pluralism.
You know, I think
But the moment we have something that's black, suddenly it's segregated.
We may be injecting too many issues at one time here. Certainly I'm having trouble keeping all of them. Let me start with this distinction between integration and desegregation. Somehow or other, it always struck me that there was a difference between those two ideas. I was never quite able to figure out what the difference was. Recently heard an interview with Justice Brennan of the Supreme Court, currently the Supreme Court's longest sitting member. Justice Brennan was talking about his experience in writing a major school desegregation decision in the late 1950s. Actually, I believe it was the Little Rock decision. He said he was sitting out on his front porch one warm summer afternoon, and a reporter who happened to be a neighbor of his came by. The reporter had just been in the South, and as Justice Brennan was writing the decision, the reporter says, you know, if you say desegregation to folks in the South, they don't get real excited. But if you say integration, they get excited. They don't like the idea of integration. And Justice Brennan thought about that a while, and he said, well, gee, I mean, there really isn't a difference between the two words, but if folks get excited over one and don't get excited over the other, I'll use the word that produces the least controversy. And it may very well be that from that rather incidental conversation, Justice Brennan's learning that white Southerners preferred the word desegregation to the word integration. that we've decided that we prefer the word desegregation, even though it's really rather difficult.
Do you see them
to
as the
think
same
through
thing?
the difference.
Do you see
It's
them?
interesting that, I mean, that to me is a confession of impotence. Somehow we have to derive meaning for things based on what white people's response is. That I think that we ought to be proactive to say what we stand for, regardless of what white people stand for.
Okay, well, what's the difference?
And the difference is this, that a desegregated situation means that I cannot prevent you from coming to my school, and you can't prevent me from coming to yours because of skin color, and that's protected by law. And that's desegregation. An integrated situation means that somehow if mine is separate and I'm black, that's evil and wrong, and I can't learn, and I've got to have a certain percentage of whites sitting next to me so those good genes can jump into the head of these black kids so they can learn. I find that racist. And in
But whose
fact,
definition
Well, it may
is
be,
that?
but it's also playing with words.
it's not
it
playing
seems.
with words. When you have a situation, during the situation in Boston, I went up there when I was with the National Urban League as their representative to find out about when that controversy was going on. Kids were being stoned. We were busing black kids from a superior black high school to an inferior white high school in the name of integration, where they were rocks and bands, but none of the leadership's kids were on those buses.
Wait a minute. Let's
And so
let's
that
be
to me,
precise.
it had nothing to do with education.
But let's be precise here. We were busing those kids because of a school desegregation order, not because of a school integration order. So let's not play with words. Let's get to the substance of your
it was
concern.
a desegregation order, but the NAACP
let's get to the substance of the
referred
concern.
to we want our schools integrated, and therefore, but not our colleges or our churches. I find I find it a bit inconsistent for us to say that our schools and other things, but we don't want our colleges integrated. We don't want or desegregated. I don't understand.
That seems to be painting with a very broad brush.
Well, rather than argue just the terminology, the words, why don't we find out, why don't I get your views on what's happened since the 1960s? I mean, it seems like we've been taking as blacks, we've been taking one step forward and two steps back. Am I right, am I wrong?
Yes.
You really have to be very careful in talking about these problems. Saying that the civil rights movement is the reason Dowling Street in my hometown of Houston is not as prosperous as ostensibly it once was,
I did not say
is, I think, painting with too broad a brush. Saying that the same people who want to integrate, if I must use that term, elementary schools are the same group who want to maintain black colleges is, I think, painting with much too broad a brush. And ultimately, it's one of the things that causes us to become involved in some rather diversionary arguments. We have to look very carefully at problems. What's happening in cities? If we look across the United States, one does find that the economic status of blacks, in an absolute sense and relative to whites, varies tremendously. It's not necessarily a north-south disparity. It certainly is not a disparity between cities with black mayors and cities not. By some ratings, and my organization, the Joint Center for Political Studies, has rated the status of blacks absolutely and relative to whites. In some ratings, some very good cities for blacks would be places like Richmond, Virginia, and Charlotte, North Carolina, but also would be Los Angeles, California, which has a black mayor. Some fairly bad cities for blacks would be Buffalo, New York, which does not have a black mayor, and Newark, New Jersey, which does. So I think this generalization that blacks are as badly off in Tom Bradley's city as in Columbus, Ohio, that's painting with too broad a brush, and one has to look very carefully at what's going on.
Okay, getting back to the Constitution, and the Constitution as it exists today, and the Supreme Court as it exists today. With the Supreme Court, is the Supreme Court undermining the gains of the 50s and 60s that blacks fought for? Is this Supreme Court, by Is it reversing affirmative action? Is it undermining some of the gains of that blacks made?
I think that, well, for me, somewhat surprisingly, in most of these areas, the Supreme Court has not undermined the decisions of the 60s. For those of us who watch some of their cases carefully, they are narrowing the broad parameters of some of those decisions so that we see a kind of sorry day for issues like affirmative action, school desegregation coming within the court, given the conservative makeup of today's court. It's something that lots of people worry about. Certainly, the court is not in the forefront of the effort as it was felt that it was back in the 50s and 60s.
You say you see a sorry day. What do you mean exactly? What do you think will happen if the makeup of the court remains as it is?
It's you look at the Constitution is a fantasy. It's something that represents our hopes and dreams. We all wish that we would live by the 10 Commandments. We don't. We wish that our country could live up to the principles set forth in its Constitution. We don't. The only time that you move toward those principles is when some element in the national polity, the president, the Congress, or the court, is providing the leadership that people will apply or think about in their day-to-day activities.
And given the leadership that we have now.
That's not occurring today. And therefore, we're not going to see, in my judgment, that kind of political movement. The movement is going to have to be forced, and it's going to have to be forced by us.
But rumors about the death of affirmative action and the death of school desegregation are at best premature right now. If one looks at what's been happening in the Supreme Court in recent years, first of all, what we call the Reagan Court really has only been in place during the past year with the appointment of a new Chief Justice and the appointment of a new Associate Justice. A lot also, incidentally, has been happening at the appellate court level, and that, in fact, is where the influence is likely to be seen.
But there's a
over
climate.
A long time.
Isn't there a negative climate?
There's a climate, but if you look at the results of the cases, just in the past couple of years, the Supreme Court has ruled on a major voting rights case in North Carolina, the Jingles case, and the civil rights advocates in that case won a fairly compelling ruling from the Supreme Court. Similarly, on affirmative action, a couple of very important decisions favorable to civil rights advocates have come out of the Supreme Court. It's a mixed picture. The picture is perhaps even more mixed when one thinks about school desegregation. A lot of those cases are still filtering up, but right now, you know, there's cause for concern. The composition of the court has changed. Certainly, as Tyrone mentioned, there is something in the air, whether it's emanating from the White House, whether it's emanating from the grassroots, something in the air which says, well, these are not, the civil rights isn't really a hot item anymore. We ought to move on to something else.
Is racism on the rise in this country? Is that what we're seeing? I mean, with Forsyth County and the KKK marching and Howard Beach and blacks being chased out of northern cities and the Citadel and college students being having crosses burned in their dorms in the middle of the night. I mean, what's happening in this country?
I believe it's on the rise.
The issue is so what? The issue is so what?
So what's being done about it? So if that's
what is different,
then
let me just make this point. What we find, and I take issue with the folks who are raising this issue in Forsyth County, because when we marched in the 60s in the South, we were opposed by the sheriff, city council, and the business community because there were laws on the books that kept us from doing, from public accommodations and all this other stuff. Okay, we had those laws passed. What you find in Forsyth County, a group of bigots throwing stones, now the marchers are protected by the police. Town council condemns the Klan. There were some whites, in fact, who invited the marchers there in the first place. So we have an entirely different situation, and there are always going to be pockets of resistance on the part of some whites. But we do not have de jure segregation in that situation. And to suggest that somehow racism is on the rise, and then the counterpoint to that is blacks cannot progress unless we end racism. That's like saying if we have 5 basketball players on the court, it goes over the middle of the game and say, may I finish? May I finish? And says, you know, coach, if these fellas stop shaking their hands in my face, we can score more points. That's the name of that's the name of the game. We have always had to achieve in spite of racism. And the issue that I think we ought to be talking about are what are the solutions to the problems facing the black underclass, the myriad of people who will not be prepared to take the 16 million jobs will be available in the next 20 years if something isn't done to address their condition. And I'm not so sure ending racism would address their condition. They need something altogether different. And I wish we would spend some time talking about what we propose. Is ending racism or marching in Forsyth County going to address the needs? 300 blacks were killed on the streets of Detroit. That's more than has been injured by the Klan in 20 years. In terms of priority, where do we invest our time?
Well, it's an interesting question. I don't know that one has to make that decision here. There are 30 million black folks in the United States. Only a few hundred of them were in Forsyth County, and I don't see why we need to spend time worrying about what a few hundred folks are doing. You may be asking the real question, what about the remaining 30 million who were not marching in Forsyth County? Or what about the 25 million blacks who during the civil rights movement in the 1960s really didn't participate in the civil rights movement?
I'm talking about the underclass.
But, all right.
Poor
we
folks.
have to worry about poor people, but there's a harsh reality out there that we also have to take into the consideration. As much as we might worry about the roughly 1/3 of the black population that's currently in poverty, as much as we worry about that because of racial considerations, as much as we may worry about it because of the burden that it's going to place on the larger society over the long run, the fact of the matter is, most black folks are not poor. Most black folks are not unemployed, and it is very difficult. It's very difficult we can't get either blacks or whites, in my view, to worry about that underclass if in the rhetoric we use, we undercut, criticize, castigate that a significant core of the group of people we hope to call on for assistance, for encouragement, for help in future.
That's the most, that's one of the greatest retreat statements I've ever heard. To say we are retreating, that's the problem. That's why you have some poor blacks picketing middle-class black organizations, conferences today, because there's this big schism where a lot of people, poor folks, feel they're being used and to use the conditions of poor blacks to support programs like affirmative action that does not affect poor blacks.
Not true. Absolutely not true.
Affirmative action.
Where do you think we get black
May
cops?
I finish?
Where do you think we get black cops?
What do you say about affirmative action?
Affirmative action affects people who are in the first 2 tiers of the workforce. Those that are highly professionalized, okay, people with professional degrees, and those who are highly unionized, like cops, like other people like that.
Workers?
But if you look at the vast majority of the people who are in the underclass, who is a dishwasher in a restaurant, affirmative action does not affect those kind of people. And therefore, you're talking about ignoring through your actions their reality and using their conditions to push for affirmative action programs that go to some people that in other words, it's a bait and switch game. We're using the conditions of poor blacks to ask for programs that do not benefit poor blacks. We need to make a distinction between those programs
between middle-class blacks and poor blacks. Is that what you're saying?
Make a distinction in terms of where that if we have a program and policies that helps middle-class blacks, I have no problem with that. But we ought to call it that. And if we have a program that is geared to meet the needs of of people who are poor, we need to say that. But to mix the two does a disservice to poor blacks.
All right, now what about the future? It seems as if today we're in a society where we're going to have two different classes of blacks, and we're going to have a lot of uneducated blacks because it's getting very expensive to get a college education, and the number of blacks going to college is diminishing. So what do we see in the future for blacks? If we have a Supreme Court that looks like, I mean, you both agree, or you all agree, that this may be a problem in the future.
I don't agree with that.
Okay, so, all right.
They agree that
You don't
most
think...
folks that I know living in public housing don't care who is on the Supreme Court, because those decisions don't affect their lives.
Do you agree that decisions of the Supreme Court don't affect the lives of blacks?
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not. They don't all, not all of the decisions of the Supreme Court affect poor people, but some of them do.
Some of them do.
Just
Okay.
as some of them affect all of us, no matter how different our lives are.
The key...
When the Supreme Court ruled, for example, when the Supreme Court ruled that the allotment to a family on welfare, that Congress could set, or a state could set a maximum amount for that allotment, regardless of the number of children in the family, that affected poor families.
Let me just read a paragraph.
If it's short,
it's very short.
Paraphrase it.
From Ida B. Wells. She said, "Let the Afro-American," this is not turn of the century, Ida B. Wells Barnett. "Let the Afro-American depend on no party but himself for salvation. Let him continue to education, character, and above all, put money in his purse. When he has $1 in his pocket and many more in the bank, he can move from injustice and oppression and no one say him nay. When he has money and plenty of it, parties and races will become his servants."
So how do you say the black man gets money?
In this country is to increase the business formation rates among poor black communities. That is the key to any ethnic group's participation in the American economy.
I think the key for development for blacks in this country is economically development.
Money.
I don't think anybody's going to dispute that.
Yeah, I mean, that's
absolutely
you know, that's
clear.
kind of a truism.
But we don't discuss how we do it.
However, now may I have a moment? Just a moment. We are, to a large extent, still locked out of this economy. And while we're going about the business of black business formation within our own communities, Bob, we have to, at the same time, be taking steps wherever we see them to get rid of the barriers to entry.
But we're not doing that. That's my argument. We are not doing it, even in cities.
Whether it's marching in
But-
Forsyth
but
County, or
even
whether
you
it's
will-
attacking laws on the level of the Supreme Court.
The idea is,
We can take one
as
at a time.
Tyrone said, the idea, or as Ida B. Wells said, or W.E.B. Du Bois said, the idea of blacks developing some kind of independent capacity is not new. It seems to me a truism. But one also operates in a larger context. It's perfectly appropriate. It's perfectly appropriate for one group of people to worry about business development and capital formation, and for another group of people to worry about barriers to education, barriers to employment, and for that matter, for people to raise hell in Forsyth County. There are 30 million blacks in this country. I don't think we need to tell each of them what they have to do any day of the week. I think if we find an appropriate mix of the private initiative, of the community development strategies and self-help strategies, and government supported strategies for improvement, whether it's civil rights, whether it's quality education, whether it is helping a young mother on welfare have her kid taken care of while she's getting the training she needs to get a decent job or to go out and open that business. We need that mix. And the talk about how one group oughtn't be doing this or how the priorities are all screwed up, I think is simply diversionary.
Let me just say this, because we're now getting to a point where we're going to do, I'd like to have you do some summations about your views with regards to blacks vis-a-vis the Constitution, what you see, well, you might encapsulate your views, and also what you see for the future, where you think think blacks should be putting their emphasis? And I wonder, you might as well start.
Okay, first of all, I think that the issue is how do we strengthen the economic infrastructure of the black community. And unfortunately, emphasizing civil rights can be done at the expense of economic revitalization. Our political figures offered Bloomingdale's store $3 million as an incentive for another downtown development while our neighborhoods are starving.
What should blacks be doing there?
What?
What should blacks be doing
What
in
we should
Washington,
be
D.C.?
doing is that sitting down and saying, what is the trade-off between these billions of dollars that are being spent in downtown development and neighborhood development where poor blacks are? How can we compel banks or to change the rules of the game so that neighborhood development would be comparable to downtown development, okay? And I'm saying that that's where we've got to place our time and energy in the future. It's not a matter of civil rights versus this, but if we approach basically what is an economic condition that poor blacks and somehow get it confused with Forsyth County and racial discrimination and what have you, we will end up missing on both counts.
Just one word answer. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future?
I'm optimistic because I believe in the power of poor folks to control their own destiny, and that's what we spend all of our time with. I'm very optimistic.
Mr. Brown, if you would.
I'm pessimistic for the near-term future and optimistic for the long-term future. I think we're going through the tail end of a cycle in which the hopes and aspirations of the disadvantaged, the left out, the disenfranchised, in effect, are going to get less and less attention. And the result of that is going to be that they are going to get angrier and angrier. And when they get angry enough, the system responds as it did during the 60s.
Do you think we're condemned to repeat history? If those who don't know history,
I think that periodically the country goes through these kinds of cycles, and yes, you do condemn it. Hopefully you learned something from the last time, and hopefully also the Constitution remains flexible enough so that somewhere within the system, when the people get angry enough, there is an ability within the political structure to respond.
Do you think blacks should be knowledgeable about, is it important for blacks to be knowledgeable about the Constitution and keep an eye out for what's going on with the Constitution, with the Supreme Court?
I think that blacks should rely, at the minimum, we should rely on our lawyers, our judges, and our legislators to keep an eye out for the daily changes that are being made in the Constitution of this country. And by that, I mean the Constitution as written, plus the Constitution as it is practiced in terms of all the political trade-offs that are made.
We better let Mr. Dorn get in here and summarize your views on with regard to blacks and the Constitution and your feeling about the future.
I think programs like this are very helpful, Norma, and I'm delighted to have been able to participate in it. Gives us an opportunity to do a number of things. One is to focus on the key constitutional tension that we discussed early on. The Constitution as a document originally intended to establish racial inequality, and the Constitution, especially the Bill of Rights and subsequent amendments, as a document stating some very lofty ideals. And we continue to live with that tension. Some of the debate or discussion on this stage has been over where we are vis-a-vis those two parts of our basic political document. For example, it is abundantly clear that voting rights is not going to keep teenage girls from getting pregnant. On the other hand, it was never intended to do that. And I think we could all agree that the right to vote is important whether or not it has any effect on the pregnancy rate. I'm reasonably optimistic in a kind of limited way, and it's this. I don't believe that the country is likely to experience a reversion to the post-Reconstruction period. I'm not sure that the incidents in Forsyth County or in Howard Beach or at the Citadel suggest a rise in racism. They do serve, however, as very useful reminders that race is a continuing problem in the United States, and that underneath that surface veneer of racial civility can lie some very deep tensions that can puncture through at any second.
Let's hope
in
that
violence.
just reflects
Now,
young people
on-
that weren't around during the civil rights
That's-
era and are not aware of. Well, I'm afraid I have to cut you off. I'm afraid that we're really winding up.
Okay.
And let's hope that we that as we move forward, I would like to be on the side of the optimists and hope that things do progress. Thank you very much for being here, Ed Dorn and Tyrone Brown and Bob Woodson.